look like they're all in the evening. I'm just gonna put these back.
Yeah, it says evening on the
Oh, does it?
box.
All right, well,
Yeah.
I never know some little people. Thank you, Lance.
I think Penelope should be here.
All right, well, Rabbi Tilton's on her way. She's just running a little.
Oh, I thought it's Eric today.
Either way, she
I
said.
don't know, I like your keep-on.
It's
He
the
was
one that
telling me
got
about his keep-on yesterday.
Yeah, she just got back from birthright. Ugh.
Oh, yeah.
So she got me this key palm.
There's another box right there.
No, that's the one from these. I was leaving these out for people. I grab them. Yeah, she got me this yarmulke. It's like a handmade yarmulke with all these like tools on it. And she works in her job is like she builds like set pieces and things like that for big parties at a company in LA.
This is your,
I don't know. She's my other $2, $122, $119.
Nice.
Yeah.
where are they at school?
I was there last week.
Well, the 22-year-old, she finished school.
Okay.
So she's in the other one's not at school right now.
And all of these sealers with the
She's,
blue or white
she's kind of
handles.
working.
Great.
But, so it's interesting, it has all these tools on
We
it.
did,
Yeah,
I remember it when I
You don't see that now too often.
Yes.
It's like, it is real Jews are in construction, you know what I mean?
That is very
In
fair.
America, not so, it's not as
I
much.
remember being shocked the first couple times I traveled to Israel. Like, in America, you never see like a guy with a kippah, you know.
Yeah, like on top of the roof, like.
Yeah, like on a roof or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Or, you know, anything like that.
Isn't that funny?
Shocked, I was like, wait, this is so crazy.
It's like, in Israel, there's a market for this in America.
Exactly, yeah.
I used to go out here a long time ago.
Anyway, I can figure out a big thing.
I think
I remember you from a long time ago.
Okay. Early 2000, 2003, maybe 2000.
Well,
Did you?
2000, I remember you a lot. My uncle was a rabbi here, Rabbi Gold. I don't know if you remember.
I was there for Rabbi Kiefer.
Yes, he passed away.
How
There's,
long ago?
you guys, there's talits that we have to wear today, I believe, correct?
Not today,
Okay.
afternoon, I think.
I didn't know. I forgot.
Yeah,
Sorry, just in case.
Zeb, we don't wear talits?
That's how we must film it.
Okay.
In the afternoon.
So nice to meet you.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember when he
These
passed
are
away.
normal at school now, right?
His
Yes.
wife is a member
Yes,
here.
last year was
Not the-
better, not
Just
Do people still, you still have students coming out too?
Yeah.
Didn't they,
So maybe, you know, like around September on the World Series.
Married.
Baseball's kind of like.
Yeah.
This is
I think I was there when they got
Great.
married.
They were married in the sanctuary.
I wasn't there for that, but I remember.
Yeah.
Maybe I can do a.
Yes, she is.
poster or
Yeah.
something.
Yes.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's talk. I'm trying to think.
I'm trying to
Before
remember
the
when he
week,
passed away.
everything in the next month is just.
Yeah, but after, even after, like,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you mean after Sukkot and all,
I
but,
think
but something around it.
he
Yeah.
died when he was really
Maybe
sick.
let's do that. Maybe even that will go.
Yeah, let's just.
Heart failure.
Yeah, her father wrote over here today.
Oh,
She went to, she's gone with, I don't know if she's.
Yeah, she did.
Yeah, so she went with my 2 daughters and another young woman from the synagogue. So they just all got back.
They can't.
Yeah, it's really nice. Not else. You know where they went?
But I remember you from a while back.
The ambulatory group out of
Yeah.
There's a lot of,
There's a lot of-
there's a lot of sort of nature stuff.
Okay, great.
It's
Sherry, I would see it's every time.
You know, they slept in like a Bedouin tent thing.
Yes.
You know, to
She's still
Masada.
here.
Did a little time in Jerusalem, time in Haifa. They didn't see Akko or
Actually, the
Haifa.
cantor
But they're really
is in
good
charge
time.
of the choir.
For the most
That's
part.
amazing.
It's a great trip, yeah.
It's great. Yeah, I'm glad it must be.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing that they do
Well,
that.
that's my car, I figured I could.
First time I went to Israel was in my junior year, it was 1987, 88, sure, junior year abroad. I've been there very
Everything sort of turns upside down in years.
This is in undergrad?
Yeah, Haifa University for Opan and Hebrew University for school.
Oh, great.
Most of my classes were in English though.
Yeah.
It wasn't like it was fluent, you know. They have an overseas school. They still do that too.
They do, yeah, I almost did it UCLA, but I.
They do say that.
Yeah, my friend got
Did you do a junior abroad at all? Or you get, my sister did. I have a sister went to UCLA, so I kind of followed her in the footsteps.
That's fine. Yeah, I mean, I lived in Israel for a couple years.
Was that really? Oh, I was part of the just said I really.
Yeah, never.
Where's the issue?
In Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
This was the big,
Old school.
This
big
is-
little chapel.
This
My
was
daughter
the
mentioned
chapel.
going back
The
there
sport
for
chapel.
Yeah.
supplies.
We used to have the sanctuary
Yeah.
So if I
and
give you a call sometime, you tell me these are some programs that are
Yeah.
for 3 months, I didn't have a lot of programs.
Yeah.
Right.
Israel.
I remember these paintings up on the,
No, those are different.
Do they have programs?
These were in the sanctuary.
and
Yeah, Shannon, we have events on campus, and Irvine would usually be my primary.
Okay, 858-952-9632. Excellent.
Yeah.
You know what,
Yeah.
this is this is Amanda's fault.
This is good, yeah.
By the end of mine.
Yeah, I don't know, at least most of them. Yeah, congrats on Amanda graduating.
Seth,
Yeah.
when did Rabbi Kiefer pass away?
On
Did she just get back, did you get back today?
The 2019.
2018.
Yeah, that's great.
I'll be here,
That's awesome.
I know I
Yeah,
was
no,
there
great.
yesterday, I know it.
Yeah. No, I have seen it, actually, I saw it.
My dad got a
Like,
hospital bed.
10 years ago.
He's
Yeah.
in a hospital bed now at our house.
Our whole family is.
Seth's actually gonna
That's
see my
awesome.
dad on Shabbat.
No, that's funny. How long have you lived in Orange County?
I live in Wyoming.
Oh, okay.
So we live in Wyoming.
How far is Brooks? So I guess that's not bad.
Yeah. My wife and I have been members here since 1980.
Yeah, no, it was really great. I mean, it was very short-lived, unfortunately, because the first year was
She was,
fully
she
unsafe, and
was
then this
born
year we
on
moved past
Wednesday.
it.
So he
It
was
was really
in
great,
hospital.
community.
Yeah,
You've never had it?
right. And they said he did, but if he did, he would be in the hospital.
Well, not necessarily.
She had a wonderful trip, so.
And he does look forward to your visit.
That's awesome.
Well, it's all right.
There are year-long programs.
See, Seth's bringing me to my
where
dad's house.
people, they set you up with a job teaching in, some underserved community, and got a lot of students that have done that. Really enjoy it. And we're connected.
Daniel, is this the first time you're meeting the parents of so many of your beloved students?
Yes.
Oh, my-
Well, I knew
Well, it's the first time we met, and then
Yeah,
I
you-
introduced you too.
Okay, well, this is a nice marriage. Are we live streaming?
Yeah, you can say something. Yeah, we're
Okay.
online.
Well,
Tuesday.
on Tisha B'Av, we refrain from sort of joyful greetings, but I will just share how special it is that we can come together this morning as extended community. We have people from already, just in this small minion of 12, I think 5 or 6 different communities represented, and that is really, I think, a powerful statement of us coming together. And we're going to begin our I'm just going to read a poem to start us off. This is by Lord Byron. Oh, weep for those. Oh, weep for those that weep in Bavel's stream, whose shrines are desolate, whose land is a dream. I'm on page 151. Weep for the harp of Judah's broken shell. Mourn where their God hath dwelt, the godless dwell. And where shall Israel have her bleeding feet? And when shall Zion's songs again seem sweet, and Judah's melody once more rejoice? The hearts that leapt before its heavenly voice? Tribes of the wandering foot and weary breast, how shall ye flee away and be at rest? The wild dove hath her nest, the fox his cave, mankind their country, Israel but the grave. So it's very interesting to read this poem, knowing that Israel is alive and well in our time, and actually that's a tremendous source of comfort for Jews all around the world. And I will say that the paragraph that we insert in our Mincha service this afternoon, there's been many revisions of that since Israel, what was written before Israel became a state, since Israel became a state, now that Jerusalem itself has like 1 million residents. I mean, it's just, the idea is, the ideas have changed, and the halacha is that paragraph is meant to change as times change. And there's some interesting teaching I'll do about that later. But we begin on page 174 with the morning brachot. I invite you to rise. Oh, I'm sorry, we're using the Tisha B'Av book. So, okay.
There's one right there too in the front. I don't think they.
We have 2 more of this.
Okay, so it looks like, Eric, we may need to break into your stash when we can.
No, this Eric.
I don't know. So, we have weekdays to read, but I think we have these for the.
So share if you can, if somebody else comes in. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan l'sech v'bina lahavchin ben yom u'ben laila. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shesani b'tzalmo. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shesani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shesani bat chorin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, pokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, malbish arumim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, atir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, zokef kefufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, rokah haaretz alamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamechin mitzadei gaver. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, ozer Yisrael bigvura. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hanoten li'ayev koach. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hama'avir she'ena me'enai utmuna me'afapai. You may be seated. Utenenu hayom v'chol yom lecheinu lechesed u'lerachamim beinecha v'necha roeinu v'tigmalenu chasadim tovim. Baruch atah Adonai gomer chasadim tovim li'amo Yisrael. Yehi ratzon milfanecha Adonai Elohai v'Elohei avotai shetatzilenu hayom v'chol yom hazefanim. Ben verit uven shein uven verit. Leolam yehei adam yirei shamayim basei terev galui. Umodel emet hadover emet v'levavo. Hanachnu mapilim tachanunenu lefanecha. Manachnu machayenu machastenu matzitkenu. Mayishenu makochenu magaburatenu manamar lefanecha. Hakol Havel. Ashreinu, matov chelkeinu, manaim goralenu, mayev rushateinu. Ashreinu shenachnu mashkimim umarivim ervavoker, valrim pamayim bechol yom. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Atahu ad shelo nivra haolam, atahu misha nivra haolam, atahu ba'olam hazevi, atahu le'olam haba. Kadesh et shimcha al makdishei shemecha, v'kadesh et shimcha al be'olamecha, v'yishuatecha tarim v'tagbia karnenu. Baruch atah Adonai, mekadesh et shimcha barabim. Atahu Adonai Eloheinu b'shamayim u'ba'aretz. ובכל עמי הארץ בשובי את שבותיכם לעיניכם אמר אדוני. Bonnie, would you be willing to read the devotional rabbinic text at the bottom of 179, please?
Once Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was walking with his disciple, Rabbi Yehoshua, near Jerusalem, after the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Yehoshua looked at the temple ruins and said, "Alas for us, the place that atoned for the sins of the people of Israel through the ritual of animal sacrifice lies in ruins." Then Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai spoke to him these words of comfort. "Be not grieved, my son. There is another equally meritorious way of gaining atonement, even though the temple is destroyed. We can still gain atonement through deeds of loving kindness, for it is written, 'Loving kindness I desire, not sacrifice.'"
שנאמר כי חסד חפצתי ולא זבח. Bottom of 180. יהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו, ואלוהי אבותינו, שיבנה בית המקדש במהרה בימינו, ותן חלקנו בתורתך, ושם נעבודך ביראה כי מעולם וכשנים קדמוניות. Please rise for Kaddish D'Rabbanan if you would like, or if you are a person in mourning or observing a yahrzeit. Just want to remember this morning the passing of, this is the yahrzeit of Devorah Rosenblum. Sherman and Devorah were members here for many years. Later I knew them from Congregation B'nai Israel, and she passed away about 14 years ago on Tisha B'Av. I also just want to let people here know that I learned last night that Leonard Dower passed away on Friday, and that may be, you may already know that. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, v'yalma divra kir'utei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon v'yamechon, u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, v'agala v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabbah mevarach, la'alam u'le'almei almaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yithalal shemei dekudesha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amirana v'yalma v'imru amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Talmidei-hon v'al kol Talmidei-hon v'al kol man da'askim b'oraita diva atra hadain v'diva chol atar v'atar Yehe lahon ulachon shlama rabba china v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arichinu mizona revicha u'forkana min kodom u'v'hon divishmaya v'imru amen. Yehe shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom v'imromav hu barachamav yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. 184, you may be seated. Mizmor Shir Chanukat HaBayit LeDavid. הפכת מספדי למחול לי, פיתחת שקי ותזרני שמחה, למען יזמרך כבוד ולא ידום, אדוני אלוהי לעולם אוהדיך. No one is saying Kaddish, is that correct? We, if you're, if you are able, please rise for Baruch Shemar on 188. Baruch Shemar v'haya olam Baruch Hu. Yachid Chei Haolamim Melech Meshubach Umefordei Ad Shemo Gadol Baruch Atah Adonai Melech Mehulal Batishbachot. You may be seated. Hodu Adonai Kiruv Shmo Hodiav Ami Malilotav. Ki kol Elohei amim elilim v'Adonai Shemayim asa hod v'hadar lefanav oz v'ched v'abimekomo avu Adonai mishpechot amim. 192. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu l'adam raglav kadoshu. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu l'har kodsho. Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu. V'urachum yechaper avon v'lo yashchit. V'hirbal hashiva po v'lo yeir kol chamato. Ata Adonai lo tichla rachamecha mimeni. Adonai Tzivaot Ashrei Adam Boteach Bach Adonai Hoshia Hamelech Yanenu V'Yom Korenu Hoshia et Amecha Uvarech et Nachalatecha Ure'em V'Nasem Ad Haolam Nafshenu Chiktal Adonai Ezreinu Maginenu Hu. V'hani b'chazdacha v'atachti ageli v'bishuatecha shir al Adonai ki gamal alai. Mizmor litoda hariul Adonai kol haaretz hivdu et Adonai b'simecha bo lefanav birnana. 196. De'uki Adonai hu Elohim hu asanu v'lo anachnu amo v'tzon marito bo she'arav v'toda chatzerota v'dehila Hodu lo baruchu shemo, ki tov Adonai leolam chasto v'yador v'ador emunato. Yehi chavod Adonai leolam yismach Adonai b'masav. Shvei beitecha v'yod yalalucha selah. Li nafshi et Adonai al Adonai v'chayai az amra le'lo abiodi. Shibchi Yerushalayim et Adonai Hallelujah Elohayich Zion ki hizek berichei sharayich berech banayich bekirbeich. Be'elam karovo Hallelujah. 206, hallelujah, Shir Adonai, Shir Chadash, Tilato B'Kal Chasidim. Et Adonai, Li'enei Kol HaKahal V'yomer David. Atah Adonai Elohai Elohim Asher Bacharta B'Avram V'Hotzeto Me'or Kasdim V'Sam Shemo Avraham Umatzat et Levavonim Al Levanecha V'Charodi Mohabrit Latetet Eretz HaKenani Achiti. V'Hayam Bakat Alifnehem V'Yavru V'Toch Hayam V'Yavasha V'Yadrod V'Yamishlach Tavim Solot K'mo Evan B'Mayim Azim. Vayosha Adonai. Vayar Yisrael et hayad hagadola asher asa Adonai b'Mitzrayim vayiruham et Adonai vayaminu b'Adonai v'Moshe avdo u'Moshe bagoyim v'alumoshim b'har Tzion lishpot et harisav vaytal Adonai amelucha v'hayad Adonai lamelech al kol haaretz vayom ahu yeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. We remain standing as Shacharit begins formally on 214. Yishtabach Shimcha La'ad Malkeinu El Melech HaGadol VaKadosh B'Shamayim U'Ba'aretz. Birachot v'hodahot me'atav yad olam Baruch atah Adonai El Melech Gadol Batishbachot El hodahot Adon Aniflahot Habocher b'shirei zimra Melech Elchei Olamim Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah V'yomad Yivrak Yerutei V'yamlich Malchutei V'chayechon V'yomechon V'chay Dechol Beit Yisrael V'agalav Yizman Karivim Romain Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach Leolam Olamei Amaya Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpar V'yitromam V'yitnasei V'yitadar V'yitalev V'yitalal Shemei Dekudesha V'rechu Le'ela Min Kol Berchata V'shirata Tushbechata V'nechamata Dami Ran V'yoma V'im Romain Baruchu et Adonai HaMevorach Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Leolam Va'ed Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Yotzer or v'rei choshech Oseh shalom v'arei et hakol Hameir la'aretz v'ladarim aleh v'rachamim U'v'tevo mechadesh v'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reishit Marabu ma'asech Adonai kulam b'chochma asita Titbarach Tzureinu Malkeinu V'Goleinu Borei Kedoshim Yishtabach Shimcha La'ad Malkeinu 218. Kulam Ahovim, Kulam Birurim, Kulam Giborim, V'chulam Osim B'yemav Yerav Ratzon Konam, V'chulam Potchim et Pihem B'Kedusha V'Torah, V'Shira V'Zimra, U'Mevarchim, U'Mishavachim, U'Farim, U'Maritzim, U'Makdishim, U'Mamlichim, Et Shem Ha'el HaMelech HaGadol HaGibor VaNorah Kadoshu, V'chulam Mekablim Aleihem Ol Malchut Shamayim Zeh Mizeh, V'notnim Reshut Zelazeh, L'Hakdish Liotzram B'Nachad Ruach, V'Safa V'Durav V'Nima Kadosha, Kulam Ki'acharonim V'Yomrim V'Yira, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavaot, Melech Ol Haaretz Kivodo, V'Hofanim V'Chayot HaKodesh, V'Rash Gadol Mitnasim Liumat Serafim, Liumatam Mishavachim V'Yomrim, Baruch Kevod Adonai Mimakomo, Leil Baruch Nimot Yitenu, L'Melech Elchei V'Kayam, Zemirot Yomei Ruvidi. Or Chadash al Tzion Tayir v'nizkechu lanu mehira lo Baruch atah Adonai Yotzer HaMeorot Ahava Rabbah Havtanu. V'avienu l'shalom, mer bakan vod haaretz, v'tolichenu kamaviyut le'artzenu, ki el poel yeshuot ata, v'anavacharta mikolam v'lashon, V'keravtanu l'shimcha gadol. Echad. Just thinking about, maybe I've never thought about this before, but this is the only day of the year, when we say the morning Shema, that we're not gathering our tzitzit, right? We say that. Well, and actually what's interesting is when we wear our talitot at Mincha, we're not going to be saying the Shema. There won't be the gathering of the tzitzit. And it makes me, we always juxtapose the two major fasts of the year, which is Tisha B'Av today and Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, we actually make up for the lost tzitzit of this by wearing our talitot at night for the Mariv service after Kol Nidre. And so it's almost as if we still get however many days we're entitled to of wrapping, but this is a fast of absence, and Yom Kippur is a fast of plenty and closeness, and it's a very interesting juxtaposition manifest in the extra time with the talit. We continue. Adonai Elohechem emet v'yatziv v'nachon v'kayam. Ledor vador ukayam ushmo kayam v'chison achon u'malchut tovi munat tolad kayamet u'divarav chayim v'kayamim ne'emanim v'nechamadim la'ad olamei olamim alavotenu v'yaleinu. Emet shatau Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei avotenu Malkeinu melech avotenu go'aleinu go'el avotenu Yotzreinu tzvi Yeshuatenu podenu matzilenu me'olam shemecha Ein Elohim zulatecha Ezrat avotenu atahu me'olam Mageinu Moshe livnei amachareim v'chol dor v'dor Ashrei ish yishma l'mitzvotecha v'toratecha devarecha yasim al libo Emet atau Adon Olamecha u'melech gibor lariv rivam. Emet atau rishon v'ato acharon. Umivaladecha ein lanu melech goel Moshiach mimitzrayim geltanu. Adonai Eloheinu mibeit avadim iritanu. Tehilot le'el elyon baruch u'mevarach. Moshe v'nei Yisrael lechanu shira v'simcha rabba v'yamru chulam mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi chamocha nedar ba'kodesh norah tehilot osefele shira chadasha shivachu geulim l'shimcha safad hayam yachad kulam hodu v'himlichu v'yamru Adonai imloch leolam va'ed Tzur Yisrael kuma v'ezrat Yisrael uvtechenu mecha Yehuda v'Yisrael go aleinu Adonai tzvot shemo kadosh Yisrael Baruch atah Adonai Go Yisrael. Shacharit Amida will be recited silently at first. Begin on page 228 or 230, as is your custom, and it concludes on 243. The repetition will begin on 230. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, v'Elohei Leah, Ha'el HaGadol, HaGibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Komei Chasadim Tovim, v'Konei HaKol, v'Zocher Chastei Avot, U'Mevii Goel Livnei V'neihem L'man Shemo B'Yava, Melech Ozer Ufoked, U'Moshio Magen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham Ufoked Sarah, atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai, Mechaye Metim atah Rav Lo-Hoshia, Morid Hatal, Mechalkel Chaim B'Chesed, Mechaye Metim B'Rachamim Rabim, Somech Noflim B'Rofei Cholim U'Matir Asurim, U'Mekayem Emunato L'Shenei Afar, Micha Mocha Bal Givarot, U'Mido Melach, Melech Meimit U'Mechayeh, U'Matzmiach Yeshua, V'Ne'eman Atah L'Hachayot Meitim, Baruch atah Adonai, Mechayeh Meitim. Nikadesh et shimcha ba'olam kashem shemakdishim oto b'shmei marom kakatu v'yad neviyecha v'karazeh el zevi amar. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavahot, Melech ha'aretz kivodo, li'umatam baruch yomeru. Baruch kivod Adonai mimakomo v'divrei kodshecha katuv lemor. Yimloch Adonai leolam Elohai Etzion ledor vador hallelujah ledor vador nagid godlecha ulenetzach netzachim kedushatecha nakdish v'shivcha Eloheinu mipinu liyamush leolam vaed ki el melech gadol v'kadosh ata baruch atah Adonai ha'el hakadosh atah chonen li'adam da'at u'milamed le'nosh bina chonen u'meid chadei abina v'askel baruch atah Adonai chonen hadad Hashivenu avinu l'toratecha, v'karvenu malkeinu la'avodatecha, v'chazirenu b'tshuva shlema levanecha baruch atah Adonai, harotzeh b'teshuva. Salach lanu avinu ki chatanu, v'chalanu malkeinu ki vashanu, ki mochel v'solech atah baruch atah Adonai, chanun hamar belisloach. Re'ei navi onyenu v'ribarivenu, uge'aleinu meheira laman shemecha, ki goel chazakata, baruch atah Adonai, goel Yisrael. Anenu Adonai anenu, b'yom tzom tanitenu, ki b'tzara gedola anachnu, al teifen el rishenu, v'al taster panecha mimenu, v'al tidala mitechinatenu, heyena karov l'shavatenu, yihina chazdecha l'nachamenu, terem nikra elecha, hanenu ki devar shene'emar, v'hayaterem yikrahu, v'ani e'neh, od hei medabrim v'ani eshma, ki atah Adonai ha'oneh b'yetzara, podeh u'matzil b'chol eitzara v'tzucha, baruch atah Adonai ha'oneh b'yetzara. Rifa'enu Adonai v'nei rafei, Hoshienu v'ni v'shea ki dihilatenu ata, v'haleh rufuah shlema l'chol makotenu, ki el melech rofei neman v'rachamanata, baruch atah Adonai, rofei cholei amo Yisrael. Baruch Aleinu Adonai Eloheinu, atah shana zot v'et kol minei tevu atah l'tova, v'tein bracha al pnei adama, v'sabeinu mituva v'arech shenatenu kashanim atovot, baruch atah Adonai, mivarech hashanim. Teka b'shofar gadol lecherutenu, v'sanes l'kabetz galuyotenu, v'kabsenu yachad me'arba kanfot haaretz, baruch atah Adonai, v'kabetz nidchem o Yisrael, Hashiva shoftenu kevarishona, v'yotzeidu chavat chila, v'haser mimenu yagon v'yanacha, umloch aleinu ata Adonai levadcha b'chesed v'rachamim, v'tzadkeinu b'mishpat, baruch ata Adonai, melech ohev tzedakah u'mishpat, v'lamal shanim al tehi tikva, v'chol arisha karega toved, v'chol evecha mehera yakaretu, v'hazedim mehera te'aker, U'teshaver u'tmaker v'tachniya v'mirav yameinu baruch atah Adonai shover oivim u'machniya zeitim al hatzadikim v'al chasidim v'al zikneim chabeit Yisrael v'al pleitat sofreihem v'al gerei hatzedek v'al leinu yehemu nerachamecha Adonai Eloheinu v'tein sachar tov l'chol haborchim b'shimcha v'yamet V'simcha keinu imahem, u'leolam lo nevosh kivata batachnu, baruch atah Adonai, mishanu miftach latzadikim, v'liyerushalayim mircha, barachamim tashuv, v'tishkon b'tocha kasher dibarta, u'v'neota v'karov v'yameinu b'inyan olam, v'chisei David mehera l'tocha tachin, baruch atah Adonai, Bonei Yerushalayim, et semach David avdecha meherat atzmiach, v'karnot arum bishuatecha, ki lishuatecha kivinu kol hayom, baruch atah Adonai, matzmiach keren Yeshua. Shema koleinu Adonai Eloheinu, chus v'rachem aleinu, v'kabel b'rachamim v'ratzon et tevilatenu, ki al shomea tefilot v'tachon imata, u'milfanecha malkeinu rekam al teshivenu, ki ata shomea tefilat amcha Yisrael b'rachamim, baruch atah Adonai, shomea tefilah. Ritzei Adonai Eloheinu b'yamcha Yisrael v'tfilatam, v'shevet avodah livir beitecha, u'tfilatam b'ahava tekabel beratzon u'tehil ratzon tamid avodat Yisrael amecha, v'techezena einenu b'shuvacha l'tzion b'rachamim, baruch atah Adonai, hamachazir shechinato l'tzion. 240, modim anachnu lach. Hatov ki lo chalurachamecha v'hamrachem ki lo tamu chasadecha me'olam kivinu lach v'yacha natata lanu Adonai Eloheinu Torat chaim v'avat chesed u'tzedakah uvracha v'rachamim v'chayim v'shalom v'tov be'en Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah v'yalmad divra kirutei v'yamliach malchutei v'chayechon v'yimechon v'chaydechol beit Yisrael b'agalav izman kari v'imru amen. And all the keynote and everything else we're doing. So we specifically don't do it because of all the other additions to our liturgy on Tisha B'Av morning. So we need some ark openers. Why don't we invite Leo? Okay. Levonta. This is from Deuteronomy, chapter 4, 25 to 40, which is actually in next week's Parsha. It always coincides that way. And these sort of list the punishment, the punishment of exile. This is long before the temple was ever built. Will be meted out to the people who have turned to idolatry. But what we understand, even from this Torah reading, and this is what I was trying to share last night a little bit, like, but with true repentance, there will be some kind of a solace and comfort. Let's see. Lou, would you take the first aliyah? And okay, Rebecca, and I want to invite and Eric Eisenberg. Would you take the third aliyah for us? At least, actually, I think I could take the third aliyah because I am doing the maftir. But, I'm sorry, but we'll find something for you. Okay. Av harachamim uyirachem et ha'amusim v'yizku berit etanim vayatzil nafshotenu min hasha'ot haraot vayigar b'yetzer hara min hanisuim v'yachonotanu lifleitat olamim v'yimalei mishalotenu b'midat tova Yeshua berachamim. May the merciful one show mercy to his people. He has always sustained, remembering his covenant with our ancestors. May God deliver us from evil times, restrain the impulse within us to do evil, and grace our lives with enduring deliverance. May God answer our petition with an abundant measure of kindness and compassion. Zev, do you want to call up Lou, or should I do that?
You can call him up. You can act as my gabbai.
Ari Ben Moshe.
V'tigale. Wait, Ari Ben Moshe?
Yeah, with Zelma.
Okay. Zelma?
Zelma.
V'tigale, v'tera'em achutolenu bisman karo, v'yachon pleitatenu, ufleitat amo beit Yisrael, l'chenu l'chesed l'rachamim l'ratzon v'nomar amen. Hakol havugel gadol Eloheinu tinuchavod laTorah, ya'amod Ari ben Moshe v'Zelma, la'aliyah rishona baruch shenatan Torah, li'amo Yisrael b'kedushato, v'atem adbekim Adonai Elohechem, chayim kochem hayom.
Baruch Hu Adonai HaVorach. Baruch Adonai Barach Le'olam Vayed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher b'chabanu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Ki tolid banim b'nei vanim v'noshatem ba'aretz v'hishchatem v'asitem pesel tmuna hadkol v'asitem hara b'nei Adonai Elohechal la'achiso ha'idoti v'chem hayom et hashamayim v'et ha'aretz ki avod tovedun mahaher me'al ha'aretz asher atem ovrim et hayardein shama l'rishtaha Lo tarichun yamim aleha, ki shamed tishamedun, v'haifi tzalonai erchem ba'amim, v'nishartem etei mispar bagoyim, asher naheg Adonai erchem shama, v'adetem sham Elohim, ma'aseh yedei adam eitz va'even, asher lo yirun v'lo yishmun v'lo yochlun v'lo yirichun, v'ikashtem misham et Adonai Elohecha u'matzata, Ki tidrishenu b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet, v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Ha'amod, Rivka Michal bat Menachem v'Sara la'aliyah shniyah.
Baruch Hu et Adonai HaVorach. Baruch Adonai V'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai, noten haTorah.
Amen. B'tzahar lecha, b'tzalucha, kol hadvarim ha'ele, b'charit hayamim, b'shavta Adonai Elohecha, b'shamata b'kolo, ki al rachum Adonai Elohecha, lo yarpecha, v'lo yashklitecha, v'lo yishkach et brit avodecha, asher nishba lahem, ki sha'alna layamim rishonim, asher hayu lefanecha, l'min hayom asher bara Elohim Adam, ala aretz v'niktzei hashamayim v'adkitzei hashamayim haniyah k'davar gadol hazeh o hanishama kamohu hashamam kol Elohim medaber mitoch ha'ish kasher shamata ata vayechi oho hanisi Elohim lavo lakachalo goy mikerev goy b'masad botot v'movtim v'melchama V'yad chazaka v'zroa nitzriya v'vamoraim gedolim gecho.
Emet v'chayei Elohim nata b'tochenu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
So I'm gonna call you up now. Tamad harav. Tamad harav min yemuna. Barasher Noach. B'sheino. Slishi. Mafir chazaka.
Baruch hu et Adonai.
Cha'ish v'tachad ki ahav et avotecha v'ivchar b'yisro acharav v'yotziacha b'fanav b'chocho hagadol b'mitzrayim l'horish goyim gedolim batzumim mimcha mipanecha v'aviyacha latid lecha et artzo nachala kayom hazeh v'yadat hayom v'hashevota elavavecha ki Adonai hu Elohim b'shamayim.
Well, you can stay for your. At this point, we're going to do a prayer for healing for all.
My spell.
Whoa, there's a lot.
Okay.
Okay, Rachel bat Esther, Rachel bat Chaya Sarah, Vithna bat Chaya Sarah, Cheryl bat Vithna, Rivka bat Gittel, Sarah Hendel bat Masha, Masha bat Gittel, Leah bat Razel, Leah bat Esther. And Rahul Shah and Jeff Cameron.
Thank you. Neil?
David Aaron Meyer.
Jan?
Kaika bat Hinda, Kaya Leah bat Yehudit,
Thank you.
Neva Simcha bat Elkamayasha, Alisha Bashina bat Elkamayasha, Yaakov Elkaman, Ben Zlatafega, Lisa Haviva bat Zlatafega.
Lou? They're here. Daniel?
Eliezer Ben Sara.
Eric?
Jane Jeremiah, Holly Harvest.
Gary Cohen.
Zvi, Ben, Hannah Fega, Pat Rudden, Blossom Siegel. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yimalei Rachamim Aleihem, Lahachazikam L'Rapotam, V'yishlach Lahem Mehera Refuah Shalema, Min HaShamayim, Refuat HaNefesh, Refuat HaGuf, B'tach Sha'ar Cholei Yisrael, V'yichazek et Yedei Oskim B'tzorcheihem, Hashta V'Agala, ובזמן קריב ונאמר, Amen. May the one who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bring blessing and healing to all those who suffer illness within our congregational families and our extended families. May the Holy One mercifully restore all people to health and vigor, granting physical and spiritual well-being together with all others who ill, and strengthen those who tend to them. We hope and pray that healing is at hand, and we say, Amen. I also just want to remember Jan London. Yitkadav yitkadash shemei rabbah. Amen. Yibraki ruteviam lifmachutei b'chayechon v'yechon v'chayechol beit Yisrael. Bagalav izman kari v'imromei. Yehesh v'rabba v'harav v'olam lomei almaya. Yitvarach v'yishabach v'yitvar v'yitromam v'yitnasei. V'yidadar v'yidalav v'yidalal shemei dekudashah. V'rich l'elam min kol berchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nachamata damiran v'yoma v'imru. Amen.
Yeah.
Scott, we want to come do Hagba?
Let's do Galila.
Why don't we ask Janet?
Janet, do Galila. Tie the Torah first. Yamon, Magbia, Tamon, Galila. Sandy. Sandy, thank you. That's right.
Yeah, it'd be great. So the Haftorah for this morning it's in your Tisha B'Av books. I'm sure it's also in Eitz Chaim, because they have all the alternative Tisha B'Av. So,
1329 in Eitz Chaim.
page 1329 of the Eitz Chaim. Thank you, Eric.
262 in the Tishbah.
Right. So this entire Haftarah is chanted in Echetrop, except for the last two verses. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nevim tovim v'ratza v'divreihem hanemarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'Torah u'b'Moshe avdo u'b'Yisrael amo u'b'nevi'ei hamet v'hatzedek asof asifim neum Adonai hanavim b'gefen v'yein teinim b'teina v'he'aleh navel v'yetein lahem yarum hama anachnu yoshvim he'asfu ונבוא אל ערי המבצר, ונדמע שם כי אדוני אלוהינו הדימנו וישכנו מראש כי חטאנו לאדוני. קווה לשלום ואין טוב לעת מרפר ויושבי כי הנני משלח בכם מרחקים האדוני אין בציון אם מלכה אין בה מדוע הכעיסוני בפסליהם בחבלי נכר עבר קציר קלקיים ואיני מקור דמעה ויבכה יומם ולילה עת חללי בת עמי. מי יתנני במדבר מלון אורחים ואעזבה את עמי ואלך מאיתם כי כולנו כי אח יעקב וכל רע רחל יהלוך ואיש ברעהו יהתלו ואמת לא ידברו לימדו לשונם דבר שקר הווה נילאו שבטך בתוך מרמה במרמה מענו דעת אותינו מאדוני לכן כה אמר אדוני צבאות הנני צורפם ובחנתים כי אין אעשה מפני בת עמי חץ שחוט לשונם מרמה דיבר נודדו שרירות ליבם ואחרי הבעלים אשר לימדו אבותם לכן כה אמר אדוני צבאות אלוהי ישראל הנני מאכילם את העם הזה לענה והשקיטים מראש והפיצותים בגויים אשר לא ידעו המה ואבותם ושילחתי אחריהם את החרב עד כלותי אותם כה אמר אדוני צבאות התבוננו וקראו למקוננות ותבואנה ואל החכמות שילחו ותבואנה ותמהרנה ותישאנה עלינו נהי ותרדנה עינינו דמעה ואף אפינו יזלו מים כי כל נהי נשמע מציון איך שודדנו בושנו מאוד כי עזבנו ארץ כי השליכו משכנותינו כי שמענה נשים דבר אדוני ותיקח אוזניהם דבר פיו ולמדנה בנותיכם נהי וישארו תקינה כי עלה המוות בחלוננו בארמנותינו להכרית עולל מחוץ בחורים מרחובות דבר כה נאום אדוני ונפלה נבלת הדם כי דומן על פני השדה, וכמיר מאחרי הקוצר, ואין מהסייף. כה אמר, אמר אדוני, אל יתהלל חכם בחוכמתו, ואל יתהלל הגיבור בגבורתו, אל יתהלל עשיר באשרו, כי אם בזאת יתהלל המתהלל, השכל וידוע אותי, כי אני אדוני עושה חסד, משפט וצדקה בארץ, כי ואלה חפצתי נאום אדוני. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, צור כל העולמים, צדיק בכל הדורות, האל הנאמן האומר ויעשה, המדבר ומקיים, שכל דבריו אמת וצדק. נאמן אתה הוא אדוני אלוהינו, ונאמנים דבריך, ודבר אחד מדבריך אחור לא ישוב ריקם, כי אל מלך נאמן ורחמן אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, האל הנאמן בכל דבריו. רחם על ציון כי בית חיינו, ולעלובת נפש תושיע במהרה בימינו, ברוך אתה אדוני, משמח ציון בבניה. שמחנו אדוני אלוהינו באליהו הנביא עבדך, ובמלכות בית דוד משיחך, במהרה יבוא ויגל ליבנו, על כיסא לא ישב זר ולא ינחלו עוד אחרים את כבודו, כי בשם קודשך נשבעת לו, שלא יכפה נרו לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן דוד. All this fasting and all this singing is catching up with me. Hallelujah, Shem Adonai, ki niskav shemo levado, hodol eretz v'shamayim, vayarim keren li'amo, tila l'chol chasidav, livnei Yisrael am kerovo, hallelujah. LeDavid mizmor, l'Adonai ha'aretz u'loa, tevel v'yoshvei ba, ki hu al yamim yesodav, v'yal neharot yechoneneha, mi'al lev ha'Adonai, u'mi'akum b'makom kodsho, neki, kapai muvar levav asher, lo nasa lashav nafshi, v'lo nishba lemirma, yisav rachamei et Adonai, utzakam Elohei Yisho, zeder dorshav mevakshei fanecha, Yaakov Selah, Susharim Roshechem, v'nasu v'cheolam, v'yavo melech hakavod, mizeh melech hakavod Adonai, Zuz v'gibor Adonai gibor milchama, Susharim Roshechem, v'su v'cheolam, v'yavo melech hakavod, mizeh melech hakavod Adonai tzavod melech hakavod, Selah, v'nocho yomar, Shuvah. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. You may be seated. We're in the home stretch, 282. Ashrei yoshvei beitecha od yahalucha selah.
Tehillat Adonai Yadaber Pi Vivarech Kol Basar Shem Kadsho Leolam Ba'ed V'anachnu Nevarech Yam Me'atav Yad Olam Hallelujah. 286. Uvalet Zion Goel Shavei Fesha B'Yakov Num Adonai V'yata Kadosh Yoshevti Lot Yisrael V'karazel Zeviamar Kadosh 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 Adonai Tzvaot Melech Kol Haaretz Kevodo Umekablim Den Miden V'Amrim Kadish B'Shmei Miroma Ila Beit Shechinte Kadish Al Ara Ovad Gevorte Kadish Le'olam Lamel Maya Adonai Tzvaot Malach Kol Ar Aziv Yikarei Batisa Eni Ruach V'Shmacharai Kol Rash Gadol Baruch Kevod Adonai Mim Komo. V'yiftechu v'chayodei shemecha ki lo azavta doshech Adonai Adonai chafetz l'man tzidko yagdil Torah v'yadir Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah v'yamad divrat kirutei v'yamlich bachutei v'chayechon v'yimechon v'chaydechol beit Yisrael v'agalav izman kari v'imromein yehi shmei rabbah mevarach le'olam lo me'almaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpar v'yitromam v'yidnasei v'yidadar v'yidalev v'yitalal shemei dekudesh b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushvechata v'nechamata damiran v'yama v'imromein v'yishlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'imromein Oseh shalom b'imromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'yakol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. Aleinu 292. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol. V'ne'emar v'haya Adonai l'melech al kol ha'aretz b'yom hahu yeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. Warner's Kaddish is found on 294. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah v'yalmad divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon v'yamechon v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael V'agalav izman kari v'imru amen. Yehi shmei rabba mevarach le'olam l'me'al maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnasei. V'yithadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shemei dekudesh b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushvechata v'nechamata da'miran v'yalma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'yal kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. Who are you saying Kaddish for somebody? Oh, thank you. Beautiful. All right. So this is, we are not supposed to learn for the joy of learning on Tisha B'Av, but we are supposed to learn in ways that will help us center our thoughts. The study of Torah Lishma, not so much. That's one of the joys that we temper. But I'm so pleased that Rabbi Daniel Levine, who has a very interesting personal history. Did you grow up in an Orthodox home? Essentially, grew up in an Orthodox home, so really is, throughout his childhood, very well versed, and has private semicha from an Israeli yeshiva or an Israeli rabbi, is now, but American born and here, and has been the rabbinic scholar for O.C. Hillel, the educator, for a number of years now. And also is the rabbinic fellow at Temple Beth Tikva. And he is going to be our teacher this morning. He's also getting another rabbinic ordination probably in the next year or so from Hebrew Union College. So he's covering the swath of American Jewry, and we're delighted to have you here, Daniel, to teach.
I apologize that I skipped over the conservative.
You're getting they're getting that from me right now, so that's okay.
Is it better if I stand there or there?
I would say probably there.
Okay. So this is, as Rabbi Marshall said, this is a strange day both to be introduced to a community and also to cultivate learning for it, because as Rabbi Marshall said, there's a long-standing tradition both on Tisha B'Av morning that you actually don't greet people. So traditionally when you walk into new spaces, you're supposed to nod but not acknowledge really any type of joyful greetings. And then also in one of the most, I think, telling chapters of Talmud dealing with Tisha B'Av, the Talmud says that on Tisha B'Av, we are akin to people in the first week of mourning. And one of the things that people in the first week of mourning are forbidden from is actually the study of Torah, specifically because the Torah is something that is supposed to give us joy. And just to grasp how strong of a statement that is, Torah has been, since the destruction of the temple, almost exactly 2,000 years ago, Torah has been the sole life force of our tradition. Torah is the thing that has certainly kept us alive through the ages. To say that we spend a day without the ability to learn Torah because Torah gives joy shows just how much in our tradition we view Tisha B'Av as a day of despair. Right? This isn't a day of despair where we despair for a little bit and then come joyful, right? There's no festive meal, right? This isn't one of those stories like so many other Jewish holidays. We were under attack and then we were saved. Now let's go celebrate. Tisha B'Av, at first glance, is a day where we fully acknowledge, we almost lean into this abyss of Jewish history and don't try to sugarcoat anything and really lean into that lachrymosity that the other 364, or Judaism doesn't use the solar calendar, but the other 353 days of the year, we really try to do everything we can to not go that direction. Right? It's so easy in Jewish history, and this is the subject of much modern Jewish scholarship and traditional Jewish scholarship. It's so easy in Jewish history to lean too much into the abyss and to view Jewish history as one sorrow, lachrymose event after another. And we specifically don't do that. We pride ourselves out of finding the joy, the glimpse of light in everything. And it seems like when we come to Tisha B'Av, we specifically don't do that, right? We're not allowed to talk about anything joyful. We're not supposed to search for Nechama, at least in the morning, until the afternoon. And for a long time, Tisha B'Av in our community has served as a communal day of mourning and introspection. So it's almost akin to Yom Kippur, if we think of Yom Kippur as an individual day of introspection. Of course, Yom Kippur doesn't have the mourning component, but Tisha B'Av has for long served a time as community, introspection, judgment, moralizing. And before we get into our learning today, just one last piece of the puzzle is Tisha B'Av is seemingly a day where we recount history, right? So much of what we've been reading, right? Last night we read Eicha, right? It's a firsthand account of the destruction of the first temple. So many of our keynote have to do with either the destruction of the second temple or pogroms in the medieval ages, the expulsion from England, the expulsion from Spain. But one of the things that we get when we actually start to peel apart Jewish history is that Jews don't do history very well, right? We have conceptions of the past, and we do value the past, but history has never been a subject that's been studied for its own sake in the Jewish tradition, right? The most famous historical event, Passover, we recount constantly. Every single day we recount Passover. Obviously, the Seder is one of the most central rituals of Judaism. And at first glance, it seems like we're reciting a history. But really, actually, what we're doing is we're finding that moral thread through our memory of the past that actually allows us to look towards tomorrow. And so Jews don't look to the past because we objectively care what happened in a shtetl 400 years ago, what happened in Jerusalem 1900 years ago. We care about the past because a study of the past in Judaism actually informs how we look forward. This is true with Passover, with the central ethical rituals, and this is also true with Tisha B'Av. And it's one of the most astounding things. I always tell this to students when I am talking about Jewish history, and it's interesting because at UC Irvine, one of the things I do, I'm both the rabbi for Hillel, and I also teach a class in the Jewish history department. And it's always, the way that I frame different things couldn't be more telling. When I'm in an academic Jewish history class, and I'm teaching about the destruction of the temple, which of course is the center of the day of Tisha B'Av, and students ask me, why was the temple destroyed? Well, if you open a history book, the reason why the temple was destroyed was because in the year 68 BCE, Ptolemy and the Roman Empire took over the Middle East in their ancient conquest, and 150 years later, they had spread and had been sufficiently upset with the Jewish refusal to accept their hegemony, to accept their religion. And so, as you read in Josephus, the Jews and Roman Empire engaged in a multi-year war, right, many times back and forth, and eventually the Romans had enough and they sieged Jerusalem, and the Roman Empire was simply much stronger than the ancient Jews in Israel, right? That's what you would get in a history class. Our tradition doesn't talk at all about the Romans, right? Our tradition doesn't talk at all about the Babylonians, right? The way in which Jewish tradition has almost seen these ancient empires is almost as divine puppets, so to speak. But what that really means is we don't blame the destruction of the temple on the Roman Empire. It's a stunning thing. We blame in Jewish tradition, or we hold morally responsible the destruction of the temple, actually for our own community actions. And this is really tough for a lot of people. Because on the one hand, I think we run the risk, and this is a serious risk, of entering too much into victim blaming, right? If something bad happens to somebody, the last thing anybody should want to or should do is say, well, perhaps X, Y, and Z bad thing happened because of your actions, because you did this. But what this amounts to in a national level is I believe that this idea of communal introspection because of tragedy actually allowed Jews to survive, right? If after the destruction of the temple, we would have just said, well, the Babylonians were much stronger than us, right? Now we're exiled to Babylonia. Or the Romans were much stronger than us. Where's the moral message there? But as Jewish tradition continuously repeats, the first temple was destroyed because of X, Y, and Z sins. The second temple, more famously, was destroyed because of Sinat Chinan, right? We weren't able to treat each other right. And so we spend this day mourning, but that actually, come tonight, come tomorrow, come the rest of the calendar, actually gives us an imperative to say, well, if we don't want destruction to continue, we actually know how to do that, right? We've cultivated a tradition, and this is something that I think is very central to Judaism. The entire rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism of the last 2,000 years after the destruction of the temple, has been a tradition specifically trying to be centered around this idea of how do we have people with different views, different community, different beliefs, engage with each other in a way that does not result in such strong hatred that our foundation collapses. And so when it comes to Tisha B'Av, this is one piece of the wider puzzle of Jewish community. And yes, this is a day that we sort of look over into the abyss and the despair, but Jews are very bad at despair, right? Even in our liturgy, right? Last night, we end Eicha by repeating, Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva chadesh amenu kikedem, right? God, you should redeem us. In the Haftorah we read today, the reason why the last two psukim are read with the normal Haftorah trop instead of the Eicha trop is because we end on a positive note. We said that God will redeem through righteousness. And so even in the moments of despair, we still look forward and we still do believe that this isn't a day of total despair, but that ultimately the universe does bend towards righteousness or towards justice. So I want to do a couple things. I apologize I didn't have time to print this morning, but I wanted to go over just a couple of source texts, and I can read it out loud and we can engage in a little discussion. Feel free to make this as collaborative as possible, and then I'll conclude. It shouldn't be more than 20, 25 minutes for those who are looking at their watch. But one of the things...
No one's looking at their watch, and you're a wonderful teacher,
Perfect.
so don't feel like... And that was a wonderful...
I was going to say, there's no clock here, so that's either a good sign or a bad sign. So one of the things in which I've made a personal tradition to study every year on Tisha B'Av, because again, we do have a problem, right? Before we get into the sources, just to delineate the problem, one of my friends called me on Friday. He's a doctor. He was driving home from the hospital, and he didn't really have time to think about Shabbat or think about Tisha B'Av after. He's actually, he was going to be working in the hospital all day today. And he called me and he said, Tisha B'Av is the hardest holiday for me. Okay, why? Well, I go to work usually. I can read the news, right? Jerusalem as a city is alive and bustling, right? He lived in Israel for a few years. It doesn't seem like things are that bad, right? And so it's very hard to get into the mindset of, sure, when I read Kinot, when I read medieval accounts, when I read ancient accounts, it's sad, but it doesn't feel personal. And I think that this is a problem that we really have to contend with. And so in thinking about this, one of the things in which I personally find the most powerful is there's a set of responsa to Shuvot that were found years after the Holocaust ended. And just to give a little bit of background, there was a rabbi named Ephraim Oshry, who was a rabbi in Lithuania, and he was very young. I think he was a late teenager or his early 20s when the Holocaust began, and he ended up moving to the ghetto and moving to a concentration camp. And he quickly gained renown in the Kovno ghetto and subsequent concentration camp as being a Talmudic prodigy. And so what this amounted to is that thousands, if not tens of thousands of Jews from all over Lithuania, at a time when communication was still possible in the early stages of the Holocaust, would send him questions. And these weren't simple questions. These aren't the type of questions that any rabbi, I think, gets today, certainly not by the dozen. And he was asked a series of questions, basically trying to tackle this issue of how do we remain steadfast to Jewish tradition while living in some of the worst conditions in the Holocaust. And so I wanted to read a couple of these question and answers, and we can have some discussion here, but again, the point of this, and we will end, I think, on a little bit of a note looking towards the future, but the reason why I think, Tisha B'Av is always sort of the hardest day to cultivate learning towards is specifically trying to tackle that angle of, this is sad, and this is sad not with a cherry on top. And I think personally, this is actually the day that I struggle the most cultivating any teaching, because my style is normally very upbeat. I usually like to mix in jokes and things like that. And so to me, it really does require a mental shift from what I'm used to the other many days of the year. So the first question that he got, and again, in teasing out these questions, we could think of them in terms of the narrow scope, right? These were obviously questions that were asked sometime in the late 1930s, early 1940s. We can also think of this in terms of the big picture Jewish history. What's fascinating about these questions, as we'll read them, is you could imagine these being written during the Crusades. You could imagine these questions being written during the time of the Jewish expulsion in Spain. You could imagine these being written in the year 134 CE, when Beitar was under attack, one of the 5 things that we mourn on Tisha B'Av. So the first question that Rabbi Oshry received is as follows, and I'll read the question, and then we can see if there's any thoughts here. So his first question is as follows, just to get an example. I was asked to render a halachic decision, a Jewish legal decision, on the following problem. A boy whose leg the Germans had cut off lay in the hospital. Wishing to pray daily to his Creator, he sent a request through secret Jewish channels that a pair of tefillin be sent to the hospital. A persistent rumor in the ghetto claimed that the Germans burned every patient's possessions upon his death or dismissal. Knowing that these tefillin would probably be burned, was it still permissible to send a pair into the hospital? So even just taking a step back before getting into the answer that he gives, right? Oftentimes like this, the question is a lot more powerful than the answer. Even this sociological condition, this communal condition where people are under the greatest tragedy possible, but yet a question that they desperately need an answer to is, well, what about tefillin? What about these things that bind us to this wider tradition? What can we do? this reminds me during the first Passover of COVID, so this was April of 2020, when everybody found out that they were going to be on Zoom for Passover, there were a lot of students that came to me and they, felt very uncomfortable. It was their first time ever having a Seder away from their parents. A lot of them hadn't yet moved out of the dorms, right? It was a very awkward situation on campus where people were still in on-campus housing and too afraid to go home. And a lot of people are going to have not their typical, or in their mind, not real Passover. And so one of the texts that I brought, we did a little Zoom text study, is it was this fascinating prayer that was found in, I think, Bergen-Belsen, years after the Holocaust. And this was a prayer that was written in one of the concentration camps, and the prayer said as follows. There's a common Yehi Ratzon that a lot of times we say before we do certain mitzvot, right? In more Hasidic communities, right? It starts Hinene Muchanim Zuman, and we say, God, you have prepped me to be able to do the mitzvah of, and then you say shaking the lulav. And so they found one of these written in this very traditional, right? Hereby I am ready to take the mitzvah upon myself of. This is on Passover. And it said, I'm hereby taking upon myself the mitzvah of eating bread on Passover. And the text continues. And it said, because God, you told us you should keep my mitzvot and live by them. And so they said, well, we have no access to matzah, right? We're in a condition where even refusing the little bit of food that we have could put us at risk of death and serious injury. So what do? It's actually a mitzvah to eat bread. And I showed this to students, one, to dispel the notion that there is one right way to practice any Jewish holiday, because different conditions arise, and you can see how Jewish tradition has dealt with tragedies like this. But also in terms of the people writing that. I mean, imagine this. They're in one of the worst conditions anybody can possibly imagine, yet they care so much that they're thinking critically about these questions of, we know we're going to have to eat bread because we have to survive, but how do we eat bread on Passover Jewishly? And that's very similar to this question of, a boy wants a pair of tefillin. So Reb Oshri answers as follows. He says, I rule that the tefillin might be sent to the boy so that he could fulfill the Torah's commandment. The story of Germans burning personal effects was an unsubstantiated rumor, one of many produced just to increase fear in the ghetto. If I had known it to be a fact, I would definitely have forbidden sending him the tefillin. But a rumor alone was not enough to deprive the lad from praying with tefillin. They were sent through a trustworthy emissary who gave them secretly to the boy away from German eyes. I also felt that the tefillin would be an inspiration to the boy, a recent Baal Teshuvah, a newly religious, who had changed his life around to become more observant. One of the doctors who worked in the hospital testified to the boy's immense joy when he donned the tefillin for the first time. On September 23rd, 1941, when the accursed Germans destroyed the little ghetto, they burned down the entire hospital, incinerating the patients, nurses and doctors and all. Some 60 Jews, including the doctor and the boy to whom the tefillin had been sent, were killed in the fire. But wonder of wonders, one of the Jews who had been inside the hospital was miraculously saved and told about what had happened before the incineration. This other boy had guarded the tefillin literally with his life. When he realized that the hospital would be destroyed together with its patients and its staff, he asked this man to help him hide the tefillin so that it would not fall into the hands of the murderer who would destroy them. The man succeeded in escaping from the hospital and showed us this treasure, the boy's tefillin that had been saved. May God fulfill the verse in our time, and this is how he concludes this answer, for you, O God, have set in fire, and you will restore it through fire. I want to open it up to thoughts, to reactions, anything that comes to mind in reading. We have a couple more, but just both in terms of the narrow perspective of the tragedy, but also in terms of, in general, what this means. Yeah, really.
Well, actually, only related to the tragedy as it reflects where we are today and the blessings of our time. I'm hard pressed to think about even many of, I have the opportunity to don tefillin every day. I don't every day. I have my tefillin, I have them with me to put on this afternoon. But I'm thinking just about the juxtaposition between the piety of so many millions back then and the changes in how those of us who survived and are the children of those who were living in another place and there but for the grace of God could have gone any of us, really, but we just happen to be here, yay. What's changed and sort of the lack of appreciation for the sanctity of those adornments and what those can mean in terms of attaching us to God. And I guess I don't expect anyone to say it, but it's a really humbling reflection to think about how much we don't value that anymore,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really powerful. Yeah, no, that is the question of our time. I don't have any answers. Any other thoughts? Yes, Scott.
Except, on ETS like yesterday, it's only yesterday, we talked about the status of Judaism and all that. And I asked Rabbi Mendelson, so what would God think of the Jews today? How are we doing? I mean, the fact that we're still here. And the fact that we're still here is a forward-thinking, idea to be proud of and to give us hope. So he was talking about halakha being really a way or a guide, and we don't observe the orthodoxy. We don't observe. All the Jews do not observe their Judaism the same way, but we're here and we have all levels of observance to what capacity we're able to do.
It is, and it is a beautiful thing. There was, I'm reminded of this, forgetting the name, this Israeli scholar wrote a book called The Ever-Dying People, where he said that every generation since basically the destruction of the temple, Jewish leaders prognosticated that this is the last stand. If we don't do something immediately, Judaism will cease to exist. And, thank God, literally, it has never happened. There's a famous archetypical story. I can't vouch for the truth of this, but I see the story everywhere, where when Napoleon was walking through Paris, he saw it was late, imagine a Saturday night, and he hears, he sees the flickers of light, and he just hears wailing happening from a room. And so he pokes his head in and wants to make sure everything's okay, and he asks one of the young French boys there, what's going on? And he said, well, we're mourning the destruction of our temple. And Napoleon says, and this is, of course, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Napoleon says, something to the extent of, oh my God, where was this temple? Can I help you? And the boy said, well, it was in Jerusalem, and it was 1700 years ago. And the end of the story goes, Napoleon looked in awe and said, a people that is still mourning their temple 1700 years later will surely be around to see a temple rebuilt. And so, there is sort of this hope that I think is inherently bound into the mourning.
I'll just say one more
Yeah.
thing. My parents, my husband's parents, they were all survivors of the Holocaust. And my father was, raised Orthodoxy also.
Yeah.
And he went through the war, and his family, he's a sole survivor of his family. And so you can imagine when he came after the war, he was very disenchanted with Judaism. And so, he moved away from it. I moved more into it because I became a conservative Jew. And I raised my kids conservative Jews, but both of my kids now are Orthodox. My son is very observant, and my daughter also, and my grandchildren wear tzitzit and wrap tefillin. So, it's
Yeah, and that ability, before I take you, Professor Scott, the genius of Judaism really, I mean, it was in response just to, I know I said I would veer a little bit away from history, but when the rabbi said the temple was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam, that wasn't entirely ahistorical, right? If we read both from, the Talmud in Tractate Gittin, right, usually it deals with the laws of marriage and divorce, but towards the end, this is where we get the bulk of our history and tradition about Tisha B'Av in Tractate Gittin. We also find this in Josephus, right? They talk about a situation in ancient Israel where, I sort of make this analogy or semi-joke that if we think the divisions in the Jewish world today are bad, all we need to do is read something from 40 CE, when you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots and the Essenes and all of these different groups. And quite literally, there was a situation where people in ancient Israel did not see each other as part of the same tradition. You had the Essenes who purposely moved out of Jerusalem to the Dead Sea to live because they didn't want to deal with anyone else. You had the Zealots who were quasi-terrorists that, as the Talmud describes, they would go around and quite literally attack people who didn't agree with their religious or political outlook. You had the Sadducees who were trying to desperately maintain the corrupt enterprise of the temple even after it had been taken over by, there's a whole history there with the Chashmonaim. And then you had the Pharisees who were basically the cultivator of our tradition now. And one of the things in which Jewish tradition basically pivoted after was we were intent on making sure that didn't happen again. And the rabbis weren't naive. They knew that we had different views in the Jewish community, right? The idea that, in the Second Temple period, we had 4 or 5 groups. They knew they weren't going to be able to magically snap their fingers and in, 5th century Babylonia, everything was going to be perfect. But they really did try, and I think they did a great job that lasts today in cultivating a tradition where we do say, we can have 20 different opinions. The rabbis summarize it, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, right? Both these and these, even if they're saying opposite laws, are the words of God, and actually laying the foundation for a community that I think has lasted till today, where everybody, to some extent, we obviously have denominations, Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Renewal, but honestly, I interact with hundreds of college students a year. Everybody is sort of not that denominations aren't important, but there's an outlook of people saying, well, I'm just Jewish, or I'm post-denominational, or I'm pluralistic, and really seeing the joy and beauty in the whole thing, as opposed to identifying first with a specific denomination. So I agree with you, and I think that's definitely an element. Professor?
So I'm just so, first of all, I want to learn more about this Talmud scholar who took all these questions during the lead up into the Holocaust. That's fascinating to me. I don't know anything about it, but the sadness of the story is just so profound that, and here's this, they couldn't save the boy, they couldn't save the people, they couldn't save millions of Jews, but somehow they were able to save this object that has this deep religious significance to us. And I feel like there's such an incredible metaphor in there, which is that, which is related to what Ruth was just sharing, which is that, even while this horrible tragedy upon tragedy on tragedy, I'm not supposed to be hopeful today, I know, but we as Jews, as a communal enterprise, are carrying on Judaism, which survives individual deaths, and I think that is sort of the little bit of kernel of hope in that story. But like, how awful is this?
100%. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And we'll end off with one story in the Talmud that I think is the paradigm of what you were just saying. And it's a story that I think also, it's a tragic story that then gives way, I think, to hope for the future. Let's read, oh yeah, go for it.
Say the thing about fire. You said that God created the law with fire and then would not destroy it.
So yes, so this is how he finished his response. He said, you, God, have set ablaze in fire, presumably talking about the temple, how God was the harbinger of the destruction, then you will destroy it through fire. then you will restore it. Sorry.
And so because
Yes.
the tefillin was saved, then he didn't. And maybe that's why Judaism is constant. It goes on, it survives, it's ubiquitous.
Yeah,
And
100%.
I think the second fire is referring to the flame of passion, not that it was destroyed through the actual element of fire, but the fire that we feel for our love of Judaism and our love of God, that passion will be how it will be rebuilt. That's how I understand
Yeah,
it.
no, I think that's beautiful. Yeah.
So, is there another?
Yeah, so let's read one or two more, and I, apologize for the somber tone here. Usually there's a tradition on Tisha B'Av morning to read keynote, and keynote are usually medieval or late medieval poems and eulogies and laments about different things that happened in the Crusades and other times, and you read through some of these keynote, and they're really, really explicit in terms of, describing what happened, and every time I read it, it's almost impossible for me to understand. I mean, as many young American Jews, I, was privileged enough to grow up in Southern California, and, certainly had, we had our problems growing up, but nothing that even approaches these. And so just in reading these stories, it's so eye-opening, just in terms of, one, how lucky we are, and two, just the tragedy that I think Jews have underwent. So he got another question, and this is October 27th, 1941, and he writes as follows. 2 days before the horrifying Black Day of the Kovno Ghetto, when over 10,000 people were taken away to be butchered, every one of the people in the ghetto saw their bitter end coming. At that time of confusion, one of the most respected members of the community came to me with tears on his cheek and posed a question. He felt that he cannot bear to see his wife, children, and grandchildren put to death before his very eyes, and asked if it was permissible to kill himself. For the German sadists had a system of extermination. In order for the murderers to enjoy the suffering of their victims, as a matter of course, they would kill children before the eyes of their parents and women before the eyes of their spouses. Only after satisfying their bloodlust in this sadistic fashion would they put an end to the suffering of these men. Because he felt certain that it would be too painful to witness this horrible suffering of his loved ones, he asked whether he could terminate his own life earlier to avoid witnessing the deaths of his family. This way, besides being spared a horrible death of great suffering at the hands of the accursed murderers, he would also gain burial among the other Jews in the local Jewish cemetery. His response is as follows. Although the man knew he would definitely be subjected to unbearable suffering by the abdominal murderers, and so hoped to be buried among Jews, he was not allowed to commit suicide. Moreover, permitting suicide in such a case meant surrendering to the enemy. For the Germans often joked to the Jews, "Why don't you just kill yourself?" Suicide was viewed as an immense desecration of God's name in the Holocaust, for it showed that no one had trust in God's capability to save one from the accursed hands of the defilers. The murderer's goal was to bring confusion into the lives of the Jews and cause them the deepest depression in order to make annihilating them all the easier. I cite proudly that in the Kovno Ghetto, where hundreds of thousands of people lived, there were only 3 instances of suicide by people who grew intensely depressed. The rest of the ghetto dwellers trusted and hoped that God would not forsake his people.
Are these responses published in a book?
Yeah, so the original was a 5-volume set in Hebrew called Teshuvot Mimamakim, and I think that just means responsa from the depths, and I think they just put out an English book, actually.
That's like a summary of sort of the.
Yeah, a summary of some of them, yeah. And I could send the link and you can share with people.
Powerful.
So let's do one more, and this will, I think, start to bring us, you know, not out of despair necessarily, but almost a way to look forward, and then we'll end with just one story from the Talmud. So this last one says as follows: during morning prayers, Reb Avraham Yosef reached the blessing, and traditionally in the morning prayers, the blessing goes as follows: "Blessed are you, Lord our God, who has not made me a slave." In Conservative and Reform, it's framed in the positive: "Blessed are you, God, who has made me free." And Reb Avraham shouted bitterly to the master of all masters, saying, "How can I recite the blessing of a free man? How can a hungry slave, repeatedly abused and demeaned, praise his creator by uttering, 'Who has not made me a slave'?" I was then asked for the Torah ruling on this question. Should the blessing be omitted because it seemed to be a travesty, in which case it would be forbidden to recite it? Or was it forbidden to alter or skip any part of the prayer text established by our sages? And this is his shortest answer. He says, one of the earliest commentators on the prayer points out that this blessing was formulated in order to praise God not for our physical liberty, but rather our spiritual liberty. I therefore ruled that we cannot skip or alter this blessing under any circumstance. On the contrary, despite our physical captivity, we were more obligated than ever to recite the blessing, to demonstrate to our enemies that even if physically we were slaves, as people we remain spiritually free.
Which is how people could have a Seder, in whatever that meant throughout that whole era.
100%. Yeah, and this is also something that Viktor Frankl writes a lot about. He was a psychologist that went through the Holocaust, A Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote, and he said there was one thing the Nazis can never take away, which was our free will and freedom of conscience. So let me just conclude with a story from the Talmud that actually, this is another story that is traditionally read during the keynote, so just a little bit of background. In the time of the destruction of the temple, there are 10 cases, or called the 10 murders. We read this, some communities read this during Yom Kippur, but also we read this on Tisha B'Av in the keynote, of just 10 individual examples of community leaders being killed by the Romans. And in one of the most famous stories, I think this actually allows us to start looking forward. So the Romans found Rabbi Hanina ben Tardayon, who was sitting and engaging in illegal Torah study, convening assemblies in public with a Torah scroll placed in his lap. So a little bit of background. The Roman Empire outlaws the study of Torah. They say anybody caught studying Torah will be put to death, right? Not dissimilar to what happened in medieval Europe, not dissimilar to actually what happened to my own great-grandfather, who was in Minsk, who was actually exiled out of Minsk for teaching Torah illegally, right? This is a story that we know very well, all too well from history. But this rabbi, Rabbi Hanina ben Tardayon, decided to continue giving his class in public. So the Romans caught him, and they brought him to be sentenced. And they decided to wrap him in the Torah scroll. And in it, they put bundles of branches all around him and set fire to it. They brought tufts of wool and soaked them in water, placing them around his heart so that he wouldn't die too quickly, but that he would die slowly and painfully in front of his family and all of his students. The story continues. His daughter said to him, "Father, must I see you like this?" Rabbi Hanina said to her, "If it were just me alone being burned, it would be very difficult for me. But now that I'm burning alongside a Torah scroll, he who will seek retribution for the insult accorded to the Torah will also seek retribution for the insult accorded to me." He continued burning. His students began to gather, and they said to him, "Our teacher, Rabbi Hanina, what do you see?" Rabbi Hanina said to them, "I see the parchment burning, but the letters are flying to the heaven."
Where are those